Thank you for coming this afternoon, and a warm California welcome to you in the midst of this magical land that you've created for us here in Colorado. I want you to imagine a scene with me. Will you do that? I want you to imagine that you're in Southern California and you are in a downpour of rain. I want you to imagine buckets of rain falling from the sky, so much so that as you walk, you feel like you might be blown over by the power of the rain as it pours down. I want you to picture a tiny little apartment up on the second floor with an external staircase going up to it. 500 square feet. Well, technically 498 square feet in this tiny, tiny apartment that's being assaulted by this giant downpour. This apartment is so small that while you're sitting at the dining room table, if you decide you want something from the fridge, you merely reach over and open the refrigerator door, close the door, and when your dishes are done, you don't even have to get out of your chair to set your dish on the counter. And in this tiny living room, in this tiny apartment, in a torrential downpour, one of the biggest storms that California had ever seen, 5 individuals gathered on a worn-out couch in that tiny living room 19 years ago in a town called Sierra Madre. And in that living room, the 5 people gathered there, people in their 30s, 40s. There was Laura. She was working on her dissertation, trying to finish that. There was Diana. She was thinking that maybe someday she'd finally get her book written. Finally, someday. There was Joe, who'd been working on his first novel for 15 years and his second novel for 10, and was wondering if he could get the next one out maybe a little quicker than either of those. There was Mike, who had a newsletter and was starting to become well known as a journalist within his small sphere of influence. 5 people gathered in that tiny living room in that torrential downpour in a February 19 years ago. And we gathered together specifically to find out if there was some way that we could do more together than any of us had been able to accomplish by ourselves. We were all feeling a bit discouraged, like we had tried, given it our best, and we were kind of out of gas as we were going forward. We couldn't really figure the way forward, so I assembled these folks in my living room in Sierra Madre, California, with an outrageous idea that maybe we could do what the Inklings did. Maybe something about being together with one another might help us get back on track and moving forward in the things that we felt that God was calling us to do. And that idea that God has called us to great things, and that the good news is we don't have to attempt them alone, really is the theme of the work that I do. That group took its name from the storm that was raging all around us, a storm front called an El Nino. So I have been part of a group called the Niños for 19 years. And Joe is working on, I think, his 8th or 9th book. I've got 3 out and another one that'll be done just weeks from now. Laura finished her dissertation. And we have continued to meet now for quite some time together. And it's that experience of meeting with this small group of authors and dreamers, and also my long-term study of the Inklings that has convinced me that we do better work together than we do individually. That no matter what Hollywood has told you, that the idea of isolating yourself in a tiny cabin in the woods to finish your magnum opus is not a recipe for success, but a recipe for madness, if not murder. And so I believe very strongly that we have a lot to learn from the Inklings. And that's why I wanted to do this session. When Brian asked me to come, I told him that I really didn't want to do a lecture. What I really wanted to do was something that was so stinking practical that there probably would be no interest whatsoever. I want to give you nuts and bolts of things that I've learned about what it's like to to live like an Inkling. In other words, if C.S. Lewis needed a writing group, if Tolkien would never have finished The Lord of the Rings without the people he gathered around him, perhaps we too could use a little help from our friends as we're moving forward on the various projects that we're working on. How's that sound? So what I want to do is I really want this to be very, very practical and very, very specific and interactive as you have questions on how we can apply some of this to various settings and circumstances. If you've had a chance to read Bandersnatch, you know that at the end of each of those little chapters, I have some ideas on doing what the Inklings did. And what I want to do here is something I hardly ever get a chance to do, which is really to go deep and, again, very, very practical in terms of what does it look like when we start reaching out to one another and gathering together into groups. So there are a couple of topics I want to talk with you about today. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Inklings, just to give you some background on how they got started and what they did, what they accomplished in the years that they met. I want to talk to you about the question, do you really need a critique group? I think we all need groups, more than one actually. Lewis and Tolkien each had more than one group that they were members of. Did you know that? They did not only rely on their friends, the Inklings. They relied on a number of different groups that they were parts of, that they were members of, that met different needs in their life. That's interesting to think about. Do you really need a critique group? Or is there another kind of group that might meet your needs better? I want to talk about the things I believe that people need from others as they're pursuing creative tasks. Because there's something about the spirit of the age, or the, I don't know, maybe it's our culture that tends to drag us down, that tends to discourage our creative productivity. I want to talk about the ways that we can help each other and some of the dimensions of that. And then I want to tell you what I think are the secrets of the success of the Inklings. So the Inklings met, 19 men, met for 17 years, and altogether published more than 150 books. That's pretty good. So what are the secrets that kept them thriving over the long haul in terms of the work that they did? So may I pray for us as we get started today? Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for my niños, for those that have gathered around and sustained my creative life and held on to hope when I had no hope. God, I pray for the dear ones gathered here today, wherever they are in their creative journey, beginning, middle, or somewhere toward those ending years, discouraged or full of hope, wherever they may be, Lord God, you have a purpose and a plan. You've called them to this place by name. You know what they need. Help this session, Lord God, to meet them right where they live. And meet with us today. Holy Spirit, brood over us even as you did over creation in such a way that something of significance is brought forth, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. I have a handout for you to go through some of the key ideas, but let me start by talking with you a little bit about the Inklings. So the Inklings start with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. They were both faculty members at Oxford, and they met at a faculty meeting. And their first impression of one another was very negative. I don't know if you know that. Tolkien was so unimpressed that he never even mentions their first meeting. Lewis wrote in a letter that first night that he'd met Tolkien, that he was a pale, fluent little chap, that he wasn't really that bad, he just needed a good smack or so. It started bad, it got worse, and it got worse because they found themselves on opposite ends of a debate that was going on at Oxford at the time about what books undergraduates should read in order to complete their degree. Doesn't that sound riveting? That was the beginning of their feud, but the feud was mended by the fact that they were both drawn to Norse mythology. And Tolkien started a small group where the various dons would get together and they would read the Icelandic myths out loud in Old Norse, and they would translate it on the spot. And so just as C.S. Lewis says in The Four Loves, Lovers look at one another, but friends stand side by side looking in the same direction, and that's what draws them to one another. And so the friendship of Lewis and Tolkien was kindled by their common love of books. Maybe you've had some conversations here with people who know the same books that you do. We were at someone's house last night, and there's a bunch of us more on the introverted side who are a little uncomfortable in a big crowded room, and so predictably we sort of are drawn to the bookcases, and we're kind of looking at oh, they've got that book, then they're good people. Or talking with one another about the books that we saw on the shelf and sharing the stories of the books that we love, and that forms a bond, doesn't it, as we get connected in that way. Well, this group that Tolkien founded was called the Coal-Biters, and the Coal-Biters was very successful in bringing the various factions together in terms of this big curricular debate. So it served its purpose, and it disbanded. So the first practical tip that I want to tell you is this: groups end. Healthy groups end. And that's okay. People ask me a lot, why did the Inklings end? And I want to say, because groups end. There is a story about that, and we might talk about that after a bit when we talk about what keeps a group healthy. Because it actually was an unhealthy, some might say villainous influence that brought the Inklings to an end. But in general, a healthy group lasts about 4 or 5 years. So whether that's a small group at your church or a prayer focus or another kind of small group, maybe a creative fellowship or a critique group, the more normal life cycle of a group, about 4 or 5 years. It's not much longer than that. So the Inklings outstrip that by quite a good long time. And there are reasons why they were successful at sustaining the energy over that long period. And it mostly has to do with the fact that different members rotated in and rotated out. So when you look at the history, the 17 years that the Inklings met, what you see is there's actually seasons in the life of the group. And those seasons are different depending on who's available, who's coming regularly, who's maybe distracted by other aspects of their life, right, that are ramping up or are settling down a little bit. And that's normal, and that's healthy in a group to have people sort of cycling in, adding to their number, people moving away or becoming otherwise occupied and not able to happen. So Lewis and Tolkien came to be friends through this group called the Coal-Biters. When the Coal-Biters came to an end, they decided that they really kind of liked hanging out. And so they made the simplest possible decision. They decided that since they liked getting together, they would just get together every Monday for lunch. That's it. That's simple and that's small. There was nothing difficult about it. Hey, want to get together for lunch? Hey, that was fun. How about next Monday? And the Monday after that. And so it went. Just the two of them getting together. And most of what they did in those meetings, what Lewis called some of the sweetest hours of the week, is simply talk about the books they were reading and complain and gossip a little bit about campus politics. Right? In December of 1929, there was a change in that Monday meeting time. They met, they talked, they gossiped, they drank root beer, I'm sure. They had lunch. And just as the meeting was coming to a close and Tolkien was getting up and putting on his coat and grabbing his satchel, he turned back to Jack Lewis and he said, I've been working on a poem. I've been writing. I've been writing a poem. Would you like to read it? And I sort of imagine him taking the big, thick manuscript of the Lay of Lathian, which tells the story of Beren and Luthien, out of his satchel and handing it over, and Jack saying something like, if I'm going to read it, you're going to have to let go of it. Right? C.S. Lewis takes the manuscript home. He reads it that night. The next day, he writes a thank you note. Dear Tolkien, I loved it. I would have loved this story if I had picked it up in a bookstore by an anonymous author. I thought it was great. Jack. P.S. Comments, including quibbles about individual lines, will follow. I rather suspect that was the longest 3 weeks of Tolkien's life, until he received from C.S. Lewis 14 single-spaced pages of critique of that manuscript. 14 pages, single-spaced. C.S. Lewis had even rewritten some of the stanzas of the poem. Oh, the cheek, right? So here's the crazy thing. Here's the crazy thing about this story. Half a page of unalloyed praise, 14 pages of detailed critique. Which one did Tolkien love? Critique. He loved the critique. He was encouraged and nourished by the critique. Why? Somebody cared. Somebody said to him in the most clear way possible, what you're doing matters. I see you and I see the work that you're doing. And fundamentally, I want to help you get there. Right? Tolkien had found a resonator. Someone who fundamentally understood what it was that he was attempting and who made a commitment to come alongside in the journey and help him to get where he needed to go. Fundamentally understood what it was he was attempting. Invested his very best time and talent in doing what he could to help. Isn't that great? Isn't that an astonishing gift that we can give to one another? That gift of coming alongside, understanding, investing, and then continuing along the way with them. So as the story unfolded, Lewis came back to one of these Monday lunches with a sheaf of poetry of his own and shared the things that he'd been writing. And back and forth, and all of a sudden Monday wasn't about gossip or campus politics or books that they were reading. It became a critique where they eagerly read what each other was writing, talked about it, stirred one another up with brand new, fresh ideas. When Warren Lewis came back to Oxford, he got drawn into the circle. When C.S. Lewis's doctor, R.E. Havard, came to the Kilns, his home, to treat Lewis for the flu, the two of them got into a great big theological, philosophical, literary conversation, and Havard got invited in. And little by little, the group grew. It moved from Mondays to Thursday nights. It moved from the Eastgate Hotel on the high street of Oxford to Lewis's rooms in Magdalen College. That was the core of the Inklings. Now you hear people say sometimes that C.S. Lewis was the heart and soul of the Inklings, or was the leader of the Inklings, or was the center of the Inklings. That's not true. The Inklings were born in the transactional space in between Lewis and Tolkien. It was that dynamic interaction that made the Inklings the Inklings. It wasn't a personality, because it wasn't about the individuals. It was about the work that they did. In fact, in their diaries and letters, they don't talk about themselves as the Inklings. They talk about having an Inklings. We're going to have an Inklings on Thursday. Will you come, right? And Inklings, it had to do with the activity of exchanging papers, reading them out loud, reading poems, reading stories, and then talking about them, or sharing ideas. I've got my characters here. I'm not sure if they should go right or left or forward or what should happen here. I'm not sure what's working and what's not. So there's a lot of problem solving in terms of the kinds of conversation. So that's how the Inklings got started. They were sustained over the years, as I said, because people kept on sort of joining them and then leaving. You have a list in your handout of the members of the group that are considered the core members of the group. Some of them are names that you may know. In addition to Lewis and Tolkien, there was Charles Williams. Have some of you read his books? supernatural thrillers, they're sometimes called. I always feel like I admire Charles Williams, but I sure don't like him very much. There's something about his stuff, but there's some great spiritual challenge in his books. During the season of Lent, to read a book like Descent into Hell is good for our souls because it shows us the effect of the choices that we make and what direction are we headed ultimately in terms of the shape of our souls. And Charles Williams was very big on that idea. So he came in like a comet, and he's sometimes called a catalytic influence on the members of the group because he had so much personality. So he was part of the Inklings. Warren Lewis, of course, C.S. Lewis's older brother, became part of it. And one of the things I love about Warren Lewis's story is that he'd been sort of tinkering with little writing projects all his life, but Warren Lewis became a published author as a result of the modeling of the group. He hadn't published anything before that. But basically he hung around with these authors and thought, I could do that. I could do what they do, right? By watching their example, he got engaged with that kind of activity. So that's a little bit about the Inklings. Is there anything about the Inklings as a group that you might like to know, or any questions that you have about them before we move on to talk about groups in a more generic or general way? What are you curious about? Yes?
I studied in Oxford for a little while. And
outstanding.
It was wonderful.
It is. I'm homesick for Oxford all the time.
Oh, me too, especially this season. So I knew about Hugo Dyson because of that, and also because I've seen his gravestone.
Yes.
I don't know anything about him.
Okay.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about him?
I can. When we think about the Inklings, you've all heard of the Inklings, right? You signed up for a session on the Inklings, so you know who they are. Okay. When we think about the Inklings, we think, oh, Lewis, because he's our luminary. We know the most about him now. And Tolkien, he must have been a big deal back then. But remember, he hadn't written anything yet. So he was just an old college professor. Nobody knew who Lewis was either. He'd only written some poems, a couple volumes of poetry, and a very, very bad allegory of his spiritual journey. So The Pilgrim's Regress, right? And even Lewis knew that wasn't a good book. He told one reader that she shouldn't bother with it because he wrote it before he knew how to make things comprehensible. But at the time, Hugo Dyson would have been one of the members of the group who was well known, very well known throughout the town of Oxford. Neville Coghill is another luminary, not a name that you might know, but who was very, very famous at the time. So there were a number of individuals in the group who at the time the group was meeting were considered the stars of the group. Does that make sense? But we look back through the lens of our own enthusiasm, maybe for Lord of the Rings or for Narnia, and we don't realize that actually Lewis and Tolkien at the beginning especially weren't that big a deal. So this Hugo Dyson guy, Hugo Dyson was a guy who would speak his mind. He was somewhat unrestrained in his comments. And he did not like the Lord of the Rings. Did not like the Lord of the Rings. No, not at all. And so there are reports of various members of the group. Christopher Tolkien talks about this a little bit. He was a member of the Inklings. And he says that Hugo would loll back on the couch and roll his eyes and say, oh no, not another bloody elf. And so it got so bad over the years that when Tolkien came to a meeting, if Hugo was there, he wouldn't read anything from Lord of the Rings. And it didn't matter. The others tried to say, come on, just, shut up, Hugo. Just come on, Tolkien, read. But it didn't work. When Dyson was there, Tolkien wouldn't read. And because Tolkien wasn't reading, his attendance started to flag a little bit. He came less often because of it. So I have argued, and others have argued, that it was Hugo Dyson's influence that ultimately brought the group, the Inklings, to an end. I think that that's a good way to account for it. But here's why. And here's the nuance that I think is really important when we're thinking about this. It's not that Dyson was negative. Remember? 14 pages, single-spaced, of exacting critique, right? And they flourished. They flourished in the company of brutal criticism. What was it that Dyson was doing that might be considered responsible for the end of the group? devalued him. Yeah. Basically, he shut him down. He said just the opposite of what Lewis had said, right? Lewis, by his critique, said, what you do matters. What you're doing is so valuable, I can't wait to see what's next. What Dyson did is say, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it is very different than this could be so much more, which is the essence of critique, right? So a lot of the reports of the end of the group say that it was negativity killed the group. I don't know. It's the right person but the wrong cause. The cause was at the point when someone says, what you're doing doesn't matter. I don't want to have anything to do with it. At that point, who among us would not sort of shut down, right? Some people say that Tolkien's feelings were hurt too easily. I don't know. If somebody was loud in my writing group and told me they didn't want to hear about what I had to share, I'd be done, right? And so that's the kind of the story of the end. I think we have to be a little careful about how we nuance it. Yeah, good. Other questions about the group or the members? Olivia.
Tell me something about the dynamics of father and son together. That would be fascinating.
So Ronald Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, and his son Christopher were both full-fledged members of the Inklings. There was sort of an informal election process. They sort of verified people as members. And so we actually have in writing that there was an official verification process for Christopher Tolkien to come. Christopher Tolkien is still alive. And I've corresponded with him a bit on some aspects of the group, and it's been very exciting to hear his take and his memories of the group. So what happened after a while is people would ask Christopher if he would read his father's stories, because it turns out he was better at the oral interpretation than his father was. And so Christopher Tolkien was often the one who would read new chapters of The Lord of the Rings when they came out. And as you may know, while Christopher is a full-fledged scholar in his own right, has publications and teaching credentials, he put a lot of that aside. And what some people have said about Tolkien's legacy is that Tolkien's legacy is so rich because it has had the benefit of two men's full lifetimes devoted entirely to it. And so bringing out the volumes that we've seen recently, the upcoming publication of Beren and Luthien, which I'm so excited about, having looked at so many different versions of the poem, I really want to know what we'll learn from this new publication. May, right? May coming out in May, I believe. Is that right? Does that sound right? Oh, no, not June. I can't wait till June. But Christopher has been continuing to discover and to organize these papers. One interesting thing about Christopher's work is that after his father died, Christopher wanted to bring out the Silmarillion. And you may know that when Tolkien submitted The Lord of the Rings, he expected the Silmarillion to be published simultaneously with it. So that's the entire history, the back mythologies, right, of Middle-earth, what are sometimes called the Legendarium. But it was pretty fragmented. It was pretty piecey at the time. And so what Christopher decided to do was to pull together the various strands in a more or less cohesive form to publish the Silmarillion. And after doing that once, he never did it again. So everything else that he's brought out has been basically presenting the variant texts of the poems or the stories and letting us enter into the process of looking at how a genius writes a story, at those various steps of the creative process. The History of Middle-earth is a marvelous series of volumes that really show Tolkien at work, and I really appreciate that. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Did Tolkien finish writing The Lord of the Rings while he was still a member of the Inklings?
He did. He not only finished it, he wrote one extra chapter that didn't get published. He wrote an epilogue. Did you know that? He wrote an epilogue, and it's in the company they keep, and it's in the Histories of Middle-earth, so you can read it there. But there's one extra chapter at the end. But the Inklings didn't like it, so he cut it out. It's about Sam and Eleanor. Yeah, it's a beautiful story. All right, so that's it for the Inklings and a little bit about my own group, the Niños. The Niños is one of the groups that I'm part of. I think that everybody should be part of several groups, so let's talk a little bit about groups. Let's go down to the middle, the second question, do you really need a critique group? When people think about the Inklings, a lot of times what they think is they need to get together other writers, or if you're a painter, other painters, or if you're a filmmaker, other filmmakers, or if you're a chef, other chefs. And what you do is you sit around and you criticize one another so that you can bring out the best in each other. Now, I don't know, but that sounds kind of daunting to me, right? And a critique group isn't actually what everybody needs. Critique groups are great. I'm not a member of a critique group. When I have a project and I need feedback, I create an ad hoc critique group. An ad hoc group is great because just for a very short time, maybe just 2-3 meetings, maybe just for 2-3 months, you meet to complete a particular task and then you're done. Maybe you want to get together an ad hoc group after this conference. And what you want to do is you want to get together some people who said, I wish I could have been there. And you can say, well, let's watch the video together. Let's get together once a month. We'll order some pizza. I'll bring a kale salad from the store. And somebody else brings some cookies. We'll watch a video a month and we'll talk about it. How simple. That's an ad hoc group for a specific time for a specific purpose. Ad hoc groups are great. Think about the possibilities for a short time to study one thing, to maybe go through the chapters of a book, to listen to a sermon series, to wrestle with a particular issue or question. Ad hoc groups are great. Ad hoc groups are very close to what I call project groups. I have a project group right now that's working on my next book. I am so excited. Authors always get really excited about their next book. It's a disease or something. I don't know. Visual artists are like that, but it's like, yeah, but wait till I tell you what's coming up next, because that's really cool. So I'm working on a book that's about C.S. Lewis's older brother, Warren Lewis. So late in his life, after C.S. Lewis died, Warren Lewis developed a friendship with a missionary doctor who was stationed in Papua New Guinea. And they started as what they call pen friends, just exchanging letters. Then they got to the point in these letters where they started to really share at a much deeper level in terms of their spiritual practices, some of the struggles and difficulties that they were having. And then the letters kind of take a little turn and they get a little flirty. And they start expressing affection for one another and care for one another. And it would be so nice if I could meet you. And oh, that would be really neat. And just all this turn in these letters that I've been editing. And so it becomes a romance, a late life romance for these two beautiful Christians. So I've been working on a book about their story. And in order to complete this project, I've never been to Papua New Guinea. Have you? So I needed to have somebody who was familiar with what life was like. And so I gathered together, a couple of my students have been helping me with the editing of the book and the annotating of these letters and the afterword that we're writing to tell the story of this missionary and about Warren Lewis. That's a project group. I said to a group of people, I think this is going to take me about a year. I'd like to get together every other week over the course of the year and work together side by side in crafting some of the components of this book, right? And my students, some of my students and some of the scholars who've come alongside have been very wonderful at just helping to complete this project that we're doing together. So that's a project group. Maybe you need a project group. Maybe there's a specific thing that you're working on and there's a small group of people who'd like to be sort of apprenticed in the process, who want an inside scoop of what it's like to do the thing that you do, and will really value an opportunity to come alongside in a kind of apprenticeship or a kind of collaboration, helping to bring that project to completion. So those are two other kinds of groups. I think that prayer groups can also be very helpful. My Niños group that I mentioned, we're a prayer group. That's what we do. We don't share prayer requests, we pray. So twice a month we get together. We share a potluck meal. We have a short time of worship. And then we take turns in the prayer chair. And in the prayer chair, our goal is to try to share with the rest something that we feel that God is calling us to do that we know we can't complete in our own strength. When I get an invitation to speak at an event, I submit it to my niños, whether to say yes or no. Right now, they are praying for us. Because what I want to stir up in you is something that I know that I can't do. That's God's work, not mine. And so together we prayed for this session, and what would I share, and what would my handouts look like? And how would that all work out for me to be able to come and travel at this time of year, which is a busy season for me? So what we do is we pray, and we've seen God say yes to our prayers in so many ways, with so many publications, musical events, other kinds of things that we've done. One of the things that I've learned about creative groups like our prayer group is that it really doesn't matter if everybody in the group has the same creative pursuit. So if someone is doing scholarship and somebody else is doing a poetry cycle, and one of the women in our group just finished, she wrote a musical based on the book of Ruth. And it doesn't matter, because all of us know what it's like when we put our work out there and we feel so vulnerable. And then we get a review and it's not what we'd hoped. Or we find that we've submitted something maybe for publication or to do a show or something, and then we get those rejection letters. When I bring my rejection letters to a Niños meeting, I know that everybody knows exactly where I'm at that day. And they know how I feel, right? And they can come alongside because they've been there. So we journey together even though our art forms are different. Our experience is so much the same. We run out of ideas. We run out of faith. Well, when I was working on The Company They Keep took me 23 years to write. That's a long time to work on one project, yeah? And I got rejected from every publisher I could think of the name of when I submitted that manuscript and that book proposal. And so I came to a Niños meeting. And I was as low as I've ever been in my life. And I said, I'm done with this project. I've worked on it so long, and I'm done. I don't believe in it anymore. My friend Joe looked at me and he said, that's okay. I didn't expect that. I mean, that's okay. That's okay. That's okay? It's like, no, I'm really finished. I've had it with this whole thing. And he said, that's okay. He said, you don't have to believe it anymore, because we'll believe in it for you until you can believe in it again. I said, Joe, I can't see it. And he said, but I can. And I see you walking through that door with a box of books and passing them around, and all of us rejoicing. I said, okay, that's bigger faith than I had. And he said again, that's okay. We'll hold faith for you until you can believe again. So about a month later, I sort of picked myself up and dusted myself off and decided, well, no one's ever going to read this, but I'll still dust off chapter 8 and work on it a little bit. And I'll send out one more inquiry to possibly get it published. Well, things turned out well for that book, and that's been exciting for me. But that dark night of the soul, I wouldn't have gotten through it if it hadn't been for the group. That's what a prayer group can do for you. Because as they get to know your story, and as you are brave enough to share your struggles and not look all, like you have it all together, there are other people who really want to take seriously the command to bear one another's burdens. And that's what we do in our group. We're different ages, we're at different stages. At this point, there are members of our group that are all over the country because people move. They move away, and many of them have started little prayer groups of their own. Right? The grandchildren and great-grandchildren, I hope, of the project that we started on that rainy night in February 19 years ago. So a prayer group can be a very powerful thing. One of the things about our prayer group is we try to stay very focused on projects, So it's not a prayer group for everything in the world. It's not a prayer group for general needs. It's not a prayer group for inner healing. It's project-centered. So when someone's in the prayer chair, we ask them what they have coming up, what they're working on, and how we can pray to bless the thing that they're working on right now. We anoint them with oil, we lay hands, and we pray for them. We have 2 other meetings you might be curious to know during the year, besides our regular prayer meetings that are twice a month. In June, we do a morning event called Grateful Hearts. And at Grateful Hearts, everybody brings 15 or 20 minutes of something that they've written or been working on. Maybe they'll do a slideshow of a coloring book that they've designed, or they'll do a reading from a book that has just been accepted for publication. And we really get to engage with each other's actual work at Grateful Hearts. Then we have a worship time of celebration, then we go out to lunch together. And then we also have a Christmas party. And at our Christmas party, what we do is we pick a theme, and everybody has to write something on that theme for the Christmas book. And then we gather those together and we print off a little booklet, and we eat Christmas cookies, and everybody reads their contribution to the Christmas book. And that's our Christmas present to each other. So the theme last year was pick a story that's very familiar to everyone and rewrite the ending, change the ending. So I rewrote Romeo and Juliet. Well, not the whole thing, just the balcony scene. And they get halfway through and Juliet decides, nah, you need to go away and get a job and come back once you've figured a few things out. So that's our prayer group, and I think prayer groups can be very helpful if you know people who feel the need to pray. A problem-solving group meets regularly to discuss the particulars of whatever the craft is that you're trying to learn. So maybe it's a group of filmmakers who get together to talk about lenses or camera equipment or tripods or is that camera stuff? You know, camera stuff, apertures, that's a camera word, right? They get together to talk about problem solve the practicalities. I am part of a group that gets together to do some marketing stuff because I'm a humanities type, and the marketing thing, social media marketing, buffer, Facebook, Instagram thing, I don't speak that language like a native. So I get together with other people who can help me to learn how to do that and can teach me what I need to know in that various areas. So sometimes you get a problem-solving group that really is about honing your craft, learning how to do the thing that you want to do. One of my favorite kind of groups that hardly anybody ever thinks of, but once you hear about it, you're going to want to get one of these. It's a parallel play group. My students' lives, I teach at Azusa Pacific University, and my students' lives have been transformed by this concept of parallel play groups. The term parallel play, as some of you parents know, comes from toddlers. You take toddlers to the park and you put them in the sandbox. They do not play with one another. They don't know how to play together. But what they do is they really like playing with somebody else playing at the same time. So my students get together, and I have seniors who are working on their senior thesis papers the last couple of weeks. And they put aside blocks of time, 4-hour blocks of time for parallel play. If you're going to have to sit there and write this paper, at least you can look over and see 4 other people who are suffering for Jesus just exactly the way that you are. And at that point, about 40 minutes in, when you're thinking, I just need to kind of get up and go check my Facebook, you look over there and you're like, maybe I better stay in my seat, right? Parallel play is when you set up times. Starbucks is a great place for this. You get together, each of you is working independently on your own thing, but you have the accountability and camaraderie of other people who are doing the same thing you are. How can writers write together? Well, you just get together for a block of time that you determine. Everybody wants to, it's kind of like runners who get together to run together, so I've heard, right? If you're going to get up at 6:15 in the morning, you know, you got your running buddy, you're not going to hit the snooze button knowing that they're waiting out there in their tennis shoes, right, to go out for a run. You're going to meet them. And so you can do the same thing with writing. If your goal is to write 15 minutes a day or to put in an hour and a half a week on a particular project, why not make that parallel play? So everybody meets together, and during that time you're each working on your individual stuff. It can be very powerful because you see these things moving forward. You don't feel so alone in the process. Some other kinds of groups, the supper group or lunch group or drinks group. Sometimes you just have a group of people that you know and you're just like, hey, could we have a meal once a month? Could we just start with that? Could we just kind of do a food thing and then just kind of talk about what God's doing in our lives or what we sense we need or what might be a possibility? And those are fun. I love mentoring groups where people who are more experienced get together with people who are newer and younger in a particular craft or a particular area. It's fun to be on both sides of that, and I think each of us needs to be on both sides. I need to get together with people who are much better than I am at certain things. And I also need to be making space at my table for people who are beginning in a craft that I've been working at for a while. So ideally, I'm in two separate groups, one where I'm the junior member and one where I'm the senior member of whatever that thing may be. Prewriting groups get together simply to talk about the potential of a project. Here's what I want you to know about prewriting groups. There are times when you are sitting in front of your computer or blank sheet of paper and you're trying to figure out what to write, yes? And absolutely nothing is happening in your brain whatsoever, right? And you're paralyzed at that moment. Is that true? Can you relate to that? Something happens inside our brains when we're face to face with another person. The minute I have eye contact with another person, more areas of my brain start to light up. It is literally how I'm hardwired. That face to face is very, very different than face to screen. Think about the implications of that for your Facebook feed. Right? So more of your brain, especially more of the higher functions of your brain, are engaged when you have eye contact with another human being. It's how God made us. Since that's the case, if I'm sitting all morning and I can't write a lick, but I get together for lunch with Hillary, and she says, how's the writing coming? And I say, nothing. I got nothing. She's going to say, what are you trying to say? And I'll say, well, what I'm trying to say, and then I'll go on for 20 minutes about the thing that I couldn't write all morning, right? And I'll say, I hope you had your phone on because that was it. That was right? That was it. Oh my gosh, that was it, right? Then you rush home and then you try to remember what we said. What did I say about the thing? What was that? Right. Why is that? Why does that happen? It happens because of the physiology of writing. Our creative work has its roots in our physiology, in our bodies. And that's why when you've been working at a project, and you're getting more and more frustrated, and your shoulders are going up, and you're just getting really mean like this, and you can't think at all, and you go, shoot, I'm just going to take a shower, right? And the minute the hot water starts to relax your muscles and the blood flow increases to your brain, all of a sudden you can, right? You're unstuck. Why do we get ourselves stuck? Part of it is our physiology again. What are we doing when we're hunching and tensing? We're closing off our blood flow. So, face to screen, we're already at a very low percentage of our brain function. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the oxygen. That's really going to help my right? By tensing up and restricting the amount of blood flow to my brain. That's why when you take a break from writing, it's really good to just go walk the dog. Honestly, just getting moving again. I either walk the dog or I wash the dishes. Something simple, repetitive, nonverbal. That's why if you take a break from writing, by checking your Facebook and your email messages, you do not feel refreshed because you have not changed your posture. You have not changed your eye contact, right, with that screen, right? So when you get together with someone and you say, I'm thinking of writing a book, And they say, what's that book about? And I say, it's about this. And they say, I still don't get it. And you look at them and you say, well, I think it's about this. And they say, I still don't have a clue what you're talking about. And you try again. And then they say to you, I think that's 3 books. Right? Could you pick one of those and just make it a little bit more narrow so I can grasp it? You can get a lot done in pre-writing and articulating the nature of a project before you even start to write. And you can do that also in a very easy kind of large group. An instruction group is a group that you are very committed to learning more, and so you bring in videos or you bring in guest speakers. I know a lot of people who are very interested, say, in learning more about C.S. Lewis. And so what they do is they say, for a year, we're going to get together once a month, and we're going to do a Skype interview with someone who's written a book about some aspect of C.S. Lewis. And they get a hold of the author, and they Skype them in, and they do a little Q&A, and they read one of the author's books. It's a great way to learn a lot about a subject and involve people at very, very low cost, right? So I want you to think about what kind of groups might you need? What kind of groups are easy to form? What various kinds of groups might meet different needs that you have at various stages of the various things that you hope to do? The Inklings were a critique group, but not everybody needs a critique group. But I do believe very strongly that everybody needs groups. We need others to come alongside, because the illusion that creativity is some kind of very solitary activity is a dangerous illusion. We do our best work when we do our work together. And that's because creative work is inherently transactional. Why do I write books? Because I hope someone will read them. And it doesn't make sense for me to cherish that hope in isolation. Do you see? It doesn't match. If I want to write books that people are going to want to read, I need to involve other people in the transactional process. Otherwise, my books will sound like I'm talking to myself, and you are listening in to my conversation. And I know that you have read books that felt that way, right? It's like, here's an author who's basically telling this to themselves, but I don't feel like I'm invited in. I don't feel like they're talking to me, right? You've had teachers who do that too, I bet. I hope you never had a pastor to do that. Have you ever had a pastor to do that and you felt like if the entire congregation very quietly tiptoed out of here, he'd just keep talking? Right, we hope that that will never happen. But you see the idea? Communication is by definition transactional. And yet, we have this myth that we'll create best if we're alone. If I could only get away for a couple of weeks in that cabin, I could get this thing written. No, you won't. I have people all the time who come up to me and they say, I am going to write a great book as soon as I retire. And I say, you know what? If you have a great book, if God has given you a great book to write, start today. Before you go to bed, put in 10 minutes, and if it's only just to articulate the key ideas, or begin your outlining process, or just to sketch out some of your best examples of the thing that you're trying to describe, or some of the key scenes in the novel that you want to write. Those of you who want to write novels, you know that most novels aren't written from chapter 1 to chapter 20. You know that it starts with whatever scene is clearest in your mind, and you write that, and then you write the stuff that comes up to it, and then you write the stuff that comes after it, and that tells you what you need to say in chapter 2, right? Things are written in this kind of constellation of scenes. And nonfiction books work much the same, where there's a certain aspect or an idea or a story that's all of a sudden very clear in your mind, and you write that and you put it in a folder, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, in order for that to make sense, I have to make sure I tell them this. And once you've done that, then so much else starts to unfold. Those of you who are waiting to start writing projects until you have the introduction, don't. Stop right now. When I collect the rough draft of my students' senior thesis papers, I tell them, I'm going to get you started on your senior thesis. Okay? And this is what you're going to do. The first 3 words of your senior thesis are, put, introduction, here. And then go and then write the rest of it. And after you've written the rest of it, you come back and you put the introduction there. But when you hand in your rough draft to me, that's the only introduction I'll accept. Put, introduction, here. So in that thing that you're thinking about writing, put chapters 1 and 2 here. Right? Or whatever you need to do to get started on whatever aspect of it you need. So I've argued that you need people, that writing and creative work is inherently collaborative, that even the act of sharing and inviting someone else into that messy process will catalyze something in you. And from the Inklings, I think I've learned some of the things that I think each of us needs from others in that process. So it's one thing to say, hey, can you help? Because this lady said, I need help, so could you could you help me write this thing, right? That's kind of like, you don't, right? So I'm going to give you some language. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to tell you what you need to ask for. I'm a big believer in the power of a preamble. If you have a significant other, you want to take some notes. The preamble. I had a roommate once when I lived in Chicago. The preamble saved our relationship because I would work all day long rearranging the furniture, and she would come home and I would say, Joy, I just rearranged all the furniture in the library, and I want you to come with me and look at it, and I want you to say, wow, what a great room. That's what I want to say, wow, what a great room. So she'd come up and she'd look around and she'd go, wow, that's a great room. I'd say, thank you. Now tomorrow, if you want to make any modifications, we can talk about it. But right now, that's all I needed to hear because I'm tired, right? Preamble. What is it that we need? Sometimes we don't get what we need because we don't know how to ask for what we need. And the better we get at asking, the more likely it is that we'll get that thing. And so on your handout are the 10 things I think we all need in order to persist and thrive in the creative work that we're doing. The first thing I think we all need are resonators. I can't even begin to tell you how important I think it is that we have resonators. We need people who fundamentally understand what it is that we're doing. Talked about that a little bit already. So while I was working on the company they keep, 23 years is a long time to work on a book, right? My mother, bless her heart, would call me on the phone and she would say, we talk about this, we talk about that, and then she'd say, so, how's that little book coming along? And I'd say, it's fine, Mom. And she'd say, oh, that's good, honey. That's really good. That's not resonating. But she doesn't have any frame of reference to understand what it means to write a book. And I could have given her details. I could have said I'm stalled on chapter 3, and I can't decide if chapter 4 should be chapter 5 or chapter 4. I could have told her that I was having trouble because I couldn't find the materials that I needed that weren't on call like they were. I mean, I could tell her all those stories. She doesn't have a frame of reference for them. My mother is a lovely human being, and my mother is a lousy resonator, right? And it's not that there's any lack of love. I promise you, my mother loves me. But she doesn't know how to resonate. I needed to find other people who, whether I was rejoicing or in despair, I needed other people who got it, who fundamentally understood what that was like. That day when you open up the box and your book is in there, and everything that was once just vapor, bits and bytes, is now incarnate, and you can hold it in your hand. That's a moment. And people who've been there get that, and they know how to celebrate with you. We need resonators, and sometimes we need to tell people, I don't need you to fix anything. All I need to know is, do I have an idea here? Am I sort of on track? Is this worth doing? Or am I just out to lunch on this? Isn't it great when people can say, you know what, here's the part of that that really gets me excited. Here's how you can drill down and make it, right? And it's so helpful to have those people, those resonators. Remember that to resonate means to vibrate at the same frequency, right? So the first time I ever spoke about resonators, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. So I wrote Company They Keep. It was published. The first review came out. You know, I don't know if you know what that's like, but the first review came out and you're like, I don't know whether to bite my nails or order whiskey, or I don't know what to do, you know. So you read it, and so it's very positive, very positive. And then the reviewer says this. The reviewer says, this is a really good book, except the part where she uses the word resonators, because resonator is an ugly word, and she should have used the word encouragers. They're different. Thank you. Thank you. There's my resonator right here in the second row. They're different, right? Because a resonator is something that vibrates at the same frequency, somebody who's kind of on the same page as you. An encourager doesn't have to know anything about what you're doing, right? In order to be able to encourage you. Because they're not project focused, they're person focused. Yeah? Right. So resonator is exactly the right word. And the first time I spoke about this at a conference, somebody said, a resonator is what a piano is. And I said, what? You know, do I have musicians here? Okay. I don't know. I didn't know what a piano is. He says the piano, did you know this? A piano doesn't make a very big noise. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Pianos make just a little teeny itty bitty noise. But the wood of the piano, the body of the piano resonates at the same frequency as the tiny little string. We're tiny little strings. We make a tiny little sound. But when people start to pick up the resonation, then the sound is magnificent. That's what it means to be part of the body of Christ. Isn't that a privilege? To be that for each other? To be resonators for one another? To say, I hear you. I see you. I get what you're doing. And even better, I'll companion with you in the process of getting where you're going. I'm not going anywhere. I'm sticking with you through the whole process, right? So I think resonators is exactly the right word and is exactly what we need, probably more than anything else. I think the others are important, but none more important than having people who fundamentally, at a gut level, resonate with the ideas that we have. What are some other things that we need? We need praise and encouragement. I want to try to make a distinction between these two words, because I think that we mix them up to our peril. And, praise is focused on the work. Praise says, in essence, that's good. That's a good book. That's a good painting. That's a good drawing. That was a good lecture. There's a problem with praise. And maybe you even sense it as I say the things that I said. Praise tends not to go very deep, to soak very deep into our souls. Because generally when you tell someone, that's a good, fill in the blank, that's a good book you wrote there. They say thank you, but they hardly skip a beat before they think, I don't know that I can do that again. I don't know if that was a fluke. I don't know if that was just accidentally a good book, right? And I don't know if I believe that it was a good book. Right? So praise is really, really neat. When people like something that we did, that's really neat, but it's not as much fun as encouragement. Because there's something about encouragement that sinks really deep into our souls. Right? So if someone says about our book, reading your book kindled new ideas for me, and it's been very valuable. Thank you for writing it. See how that's different than that's a good book? Part of it is specificity, but a lot of it has to do with focus. I gave a talk recently, and I was very nervous about this talk. And at the end of my talk, one of my friends said, "You're a good communicator. I really tracked with you the whole time you were talking." So much different than saying, "That was a good talk." Do you hear the difference? Encouragement directed toward the person. When we can tell someone, as we look at their painting, your use of color is extraordinary. I love what you're doing there. Do you see how that's different than, it's good, or I like it, which is a different kind of response. So again, when we're asking for feedback, often it's helpful for us to distinguish between praise and encouragement. Praise says, this is good, the work is good. Encouragement says, you have what it takes. And it's a reflection of our ability to maybe get the job done. Practical help is sometimes something that we need. A lot of times when I'm stuck on a project, what I need is help. Now, you all know, because you've been to like marriage seminars and psychology seminars and stuff, that giving someone help when they haven't asked for help is a problem, right? We are often quick to try to fix things. And so here again, the preamble is helpful. If you need help, to be able to ask literally for help. Hi, I'm stuck. I need help. This sounds boring to me. I don't know what to do. How can I fix this? Right? And to have people that we can ask those kinds of questions. Or I've just gotten my 89th rejection letter. Help. Help. What should I do now? Right? Well, maybe let's look at your query letter. Maybe let's look at your book description. Maybe let's look at your sample chapter. Maybe we can fix something so that you're not stuck anymore. It's a dangerous thing, though, to do problem solving when what someone needs is encouragement. Yeah? It can be very hurtful, actually, because then they feel like you're trying to fix them, when what they may most need is some word of kindness or faith to kind of fill them up and keep them going. One of my favorite kinds of help that we can give each other, one of the things I think that creatives need, is we need a little bit we need a little pressure. We function well when we have deadlines. I think one of the reasons that the Inklings were so successful is they knew, sure as shooting, every Thursday, just like clockwork, 9 o'clock at night, Lewis was going to sit down, light his pipe, look around the room and say, well, has nobody got anything to read us? Right? Now, some people call that accountability. I don't like the word accountability as much as I like the word expectation. Would you write more on a Wednesday if you knew that on Thursday there would be people eagerly expectant for what you had done that week in terms of the next chapter or the new section of whatever it was you were working on? We thrive in a spirit of expectation, right? People who are expectant that will continue to move forward in the project. Some other things here. Opposing is when you tell someone this is not working. Opposing is a really valuable thing. Opposing is different than criticism. Criticism, right, is when you tell them to try something, right? Or you tell them to fix or repair something. Opposition is when you go, whoa, we are off track here. Something is off track in your project. This is not, you shouldn't do this. This is a problem. There's a problem here. Put on the brakes, right? That's opposition. What I like about opposition is that it has one of two effects. Some of you have read Bandersnatch. I tell the story in the beginning of that book about when I started working on trying to discern what it was that the Inklings did in their meetings. My questions were very simple. What did they say to each other, and what difference did it make in the books that they were writing? And I thought, I can find the answers to these two questions. But when I started working on it, my mentor took me aside and he said, don't do this. He said, I don't want to see you waste your very promising career. He said, you're right, they had a lot of influence on each other, but you will never find adequate evidence of that because they didn't take minutes in their meetings. And I don't want you to spend the next 20 years chasing all over the place looking for something you're never going to find. That was hard because I was very young and I hadn't published anything. And he was my academic advisor. He was my mentor in the field. And he tried to be encouraging, right? He tried to encourage me. He was trying to keep me from a dead end. So what I had to decide was, how important was this? Maybe I should have just given it all up. I didn't, though. because I couldn't. Because in that moment, I decided that no matter what it took, I was going to find the answer to those two questions. What did they talk about and what difference did it make? And that I was not going to be deterred, that this was important to me, no matter what. Okay, I cried for 3 weeks, and then I decided that this is important to me, and I'm not going to give up no matter what. And it was that digging deep, right, into the bottom of your soul and deciding, I'm doing this. And there are going to be obstacles, and there are going to be setbacks, and there's going to be delays, but I'm doing this. I'm going to find out what I can. I'm going to go wherever the evidence leads me. And I had the privilege of reading so many of their manuscripts and letters and diary entries and piecing together, kind of like Sherlock Holmes, where one of the Inklings made a comment to another. Like the time that Lewis told Tolkien, there's too much dialogue, not enough action in the early chapters of Lord of the Rings. Oh, that was golden. Why? Because it's measurable, right? So Lewis says, we have it on record, Lewis says, too much dialogue, too much hobbit talk, not enough narrative, not enough action. You got to cut the dialogue, you got to pick up the pace. Okay. Then you look at the manuscript, you look at Tolkien's first draft. You count the number of words in the dialogue. Then you look at the final draft and you count the number of words in the dialogue. And if they're the same, Tolkien ignored the advice. But if they're not the same, then he responded to the advice he was given. Do you know what? He cut 40% of the dialogue. 40% of the dialogue got cut because Lewis made a comment. He responded to it. Of course, my favorite example of that, the story that I love almost as much as anything about Lord of the Rings, is, you know, that when Tolkien wrote that, he got really, really bored with it. You know why he started the Lord of the Rings, right? Because he wrote The Hobbit, and the publisher said, The Hobbit is brilliant. Write me another, just exactly like it, except not the same. Right? That's what publishers do. And so Tolkien wrote back to his publisher. He said, I don't have anything else to say. And they were like, I don't care, just write another book about hobbits. And so he sat down and said, okay, we'll have a birthday party. I don't know, right? So he starts writing the first chapters of The Lord of the Rings. We'll have a hobbit birthday party. We'll do a vanishing act with the magic ring. I don't know, right? So he wrote 3 chapters, and he's like, I'm stuck. Sits down to lunch with Lewis and says, I hate this. It's terrible. To which Lewis responds, yeah, it's really bad. And Tolkien says, yeah. And Lewis says, do you want to know why it's bad? Tolkien says, yeah. Why is it bad? I'm paraphrasing. You know, right? Tolkien says, well, why is it bad? And Lewis says, the book is boring because hobbits are only interesting when they are in un-hobbit-like situations. So Tolkien goes home, and hobbits are only interesting when they're in un-hobbit-like situations. Hobbits are only interesting when they're in un-hobbit-like situations. So what he does that night, we have the letters, and we have the manuscript. That night, Tolkien rewrites the scene. You know where the hobbits are on the road and they hear a horse coming, right? Right? And they hide in the movie, they hide in the roots of the trees. And up there's that big black horse, right? In the original, that's Gandalf on the horse. In the rewrite, it's a black rider. That night, black riders ride into the story. I'll put these hobbits in an un-hobbit-like situation, right? But nobody knows what the black riders are at that point, not even Tolkien himself. But all of a sudden, there's danger. The stakes are much higher, and something much bigger is going on. So, of course, the story is more interesting. What happens at that moment is Tolkien becomes enchanted with his own story. Isn't that cool? A comment that changes the entire trajectory from another Hobbit story to something epic like Lord of the Rings. I love that, right? So there are a lot of different ways that we can ask for help and get it within the context of getting feedback on the work that we do. I think that's all important. So we think about the Inklings, we think about the groups that we may need, we think about the kinds of requests that we may make, but then we try to think of some really, really simple principles that help groups like the Inklings or the Niños to thrive. And the biggest secret of them all is so simple, and that's to start small. When Lewis and Tolkien got started, they didn't say, hey, let's become the Inklings, and right? Hey, you're Tolkien and I'm Lewis, so we ought to have a big thing going. They were couple college professors. They decided to get together for lunch once a week. It was so small and simple, and then as a result of their conversation, these things emerged from it. So I think that one of the most important things for you to think about as you think about being an Inkling is to think about starting very small and simple. Maybe just a group to read a book that someone has recommended here at this conference that has enchanted you or that you're curious about, or that will speak into where you are spiritually or creatively, theologically. Starting small, growing slow. People have criticized the Inklings for not letting in women or not letting in this kind of person or that kind, for being selective in the people that they let in. You know that the Inklings met twice a week? Did you know that? Thursday nights was the meeting that they called the Inklings. We're going to have an Inklings on Thursday night. Tuesdays was an open meeting in the pub, Eagle and Child, yeah, Bird and Baby. And lots of people came and went, women, students, different individuals, colleagues, but they didn't read their manuscripts at those meetings. And if you're an author, you know why, right? Because you don't just throw your stuff out there for just anybody, right? That's foolish. That's not brave, that's foolish, right? So it's in the more curated group that they would actually share the drafts of the things that they were working on. And they grew slow. When we start small groups, like say you want to start a book club at your church, the tendency for us is to try to throw out a really broad net. Let's try to get 50 people because then there'll be attrition and we'll be down to a core of 12, right? Isn't that how we do it? But that doesn't work well because then you've got 12 people trying to figure out what to do. Start small. 5 people on a dark and stormy night. 2 people meeting for lunch. And then grow slowly, one after another, as God brings just the right people into your sphere. After the group is established and you know what it's about, you know what its texture is, and you know what its mood is, and you know what its rhythms are. Are snarky comments welcome? Well, okay then. That's the kind of group we are. And once you know what kind of group you are, then you can invite others to join you in that journey going forward. Does that make sense? So you want to get a book group started, start small. 2 couples getting together and saying, hey, we're really electrified by a lot of the things that we heard at this conference. Can we do some follow-up together, right? 4 college students or 3 people who live in the same part of the country who hadn't met before this weekend. To get together to start something small and then see if the Lord will add to your number step by step as the group grows. So the Inklings started small, restricted their membership. They met often. I think regular rhythms of meeting can be very, very helpful. The structure was rigid. The purpose was focused, and that's an important one too. Another mistake I think we make is we try to do too much. And it really works, just like with our Niños group or with the Inklings, to have a core purpose that's very, very focused. And that can help really to give you a sense of forward momentum and identity. Another thing is that the attendance was flexible. Some of the Inklings attended only very occasionally. Once every few months they would drop in. Now if somebody did that for most of our Bible studies, we would think that they weren't very spiritual. Right? They're more spiritual. But some people, that's just their natural rhythm, right? We have people in the Niños who are pretty much going to be there every time we meet. Every time there's a meeting, I know I can count on certain people being there. There are other people that every other month I'm going to get an email, hey, I haven't seen you in a while, I'm going to come on Saturday, right? So people have their own rhythms. Let them. Let people come with the frequency and to be engaged at the level that they feel comfortable. That's okay. Be the kind of place that's able to affirm that kind of flexibility in terms of structure. And that can work, I think, really well for you.